He came home before sunrise to find his kitchen destroyed, and his daughter-in-law calling him a freeloader in his own house. He said nothing. He cleaned the mess and walked away, because they had no idea what the old man in the work uniform was about to uncover. I am 68 years old, and I have spent the last 11 months patching a stretch of road called Oak Creek Lane, not because the city asked me to, because my name was on the original contract in 2003, back when I ran a company with 43 men under me. I am not the kind of man who walks away from work that still carries his signature. That night, I was crouched over a 6-foot crack in the center line when Mike, my night shift partner, set down his cones beside me. "Third time this section's cracked, Walter." I told him the truth. Whoever repaved this in 2017 used a mix rated for light residential traffic on a commercial corridor. My work from 2003 was still holding underneath. What was failing was what someone else had layered on top. Mike asked why a man who used to run a whole company was out here at midnight with a trowel. I told him, because my name is still on it, even if nobody else remembers that anymore. We talked about my wife, Helen. Pancreatic cancer took her 4 years ago, 90 days from diagnosis to gone. Mike squeezed my shoulder the way working men do. Quick, solid, no fuss. And we packed up in the kind of silence that only exists between two people who've shared enough night shifts that words become optional. I drove home to the craftsman house I built with my own crew in 1988, the year my son David was born. Porch light on, same as always. Helen always said a lit porch meant the house still believed someone was coming home. But the kitchen light was burning too, and that was wrong. Everyone in that house was asleep by 10 except me. I walked in on wreckage. Plates swept off the table, a chair on its side, a serving dish upside down with its contents spreading across the hardwood. Amanda, my daughter-in-law, stood at the counter, gripping the edge so hard her knuckles had gone white. Mascara tracked down both cheeks. My son David stood in the doorway, arms crossed, scrolling his phone. She turned and unloaded on me, my uniform, my grease, what her friends thought when they saw my work boots on the porch. "You are a low-class freeloader," she said. Each word landed like a spike. "You don't belong in this house." I looked at my son. He didn't look up from his phone. Something in me went cold and still instead of angry. The same feeling I used to get across a negotiating table when the other side finally showed their hand. I said, "Good night, Amanda," rinsed the dish, folded the towel the way Helen always had, and walked upstairs without another word. I didn't sleep. Instead, I listened through the floor as David's voice dropped into something managed, careful. Not the voice of a man comforting his wife, but the voice of a man handling a situation. That flatness told me more than anything Amanda had screamed at me. By morning, the kitchen was clean. I'd mopped it myself near 1 a.m. I sat with the small green notebook Helen gave me decades ago, the one I've refilled a dozen times since, and wrote down what I'd heard through the wall. Not Amanda's words. Those didn't need ink. David's tone. Managed. Not worried about her. Worried about something else. When David came down for work, I told him plainly. She seemed frightened last night, more than angry. Something flickered behind his eyes, gone in an instant, replaced by a rehearsed smile. "She's stressed. Work's been brutal." "She didn't mean it, Dad." I told him she meant every word. That wasn't what concerned me. What concerned me was that she'd been terrified, not angry. He checked his watch and left for work. Later, at the kitchen window, I heard Amanda upstairs on the phone, voice pitching and dropping in the rhythm of someone pleading with a person who held power over her. One name came through the plaster clearly. Richard. I sat down and wrote that name in my notebook, underlined once, and let myself remember exactly who Richard Collins was. In 2008, Richard came to my office, 33, sharp-eyed, wearing a suit slightly too good for his station, asking me to co-sign his contractor's bond because 3 bonding companies had turned him down. My gut said no. I said yes anyway, because he reminded me of myself at that age. He never came back to thank me. Instead, in 2017, he underbid my company on this very stretch of Oak Creek Lane by a margin only possible through material substitution, a fact my engineer's core samples confirmed and the city inspector never acted on. Richard cashed his check and bought himself a downtown building. Now his name was surfacing in my son's kitchen, wrapped inside my daughter-in-law's fear. A week passed. I watched. David started performing. Coffee he'd never made me before. Sitting through the news with me for the first time in 8 months, asking about my knee. Every gesture technically kind, and every one of them wrong in temperature. Rehearsed, room temperature kindness on a schedule. That Saturday he invited colleagues to dinner, and over tiramisu his voice dropped into a practiced, confiding register. It's been a hard year, running the household with Dad here. He can't really manage on his own anymore. His guests nodded sympathetically while I sat at the same table, having paid for that dinner's electricity myself, and said nothing. Afterward, I heard him in the hallway, phone to his ear, no longer bothering to lower his voice. He doesn't ask questions. I've got it managed. I sat in my office with the notebook and wrote. Tonight I found out what I am to him. Tomorrow I find out who he's talking to. I didn't sleep. Instead, I used the tools I'd trusted for 40 years. Public records. California's Secretary of State database showed Collins Development Group, registered 2010, with 4 related entities, the kind of structure useful for moving money quietly. The city's contract database showed Collins had landed 11 municipal contracts, 7 of them resurfacing jobs, the category where I already knew, from core samples no inspector had wanted to act on, that Richard cut corners. At the library, my old friend Margaret pulled a subcontractor disclosure, filed on the very Oak Creek project I'd repaired for a decade. David Hayes, my son, listed as an independent business consultant for Collins Development, retained 23 months earlier, 8 months before Amanda had ever joined Richard's company. David hadn't stumbled into this connection through his wife. He'd built the bridge himself and let her walk across it without knowing who'd built it or why. 3 days later, he invited another set of colleagues to dinner and delivered the exact same rehearsed monologue about his burdensome father, word for word, to a real estate contact named Barry and his sharp-eyed wife Donna. I sat with my hands pressed flat under the table, counting the fabric under my palms to keep my face still, understanding fully now, I wasn't a father to him anymore. I was a prop. After that dinner, I saw him at his computer through his half-open office door. Dark background, orange headers, dense columns scrolling under his thumb. Not a bank, not an investment account. A hard money lending platform, the kind you use when you're desperate and no bank will touch you. At the county recorder's office the next morning, I found it. A deed of trust recorded that August. Meridian Capital Solutions, securing a promissory note for $340,000 against 14 Oak Creek Lane, my house, the one I'd gifted to David in 2022, with my son as sole borrower. He'd mortgaged the house I built with my own hands and never said a word. I ran into my old banking colleague Frank Donahue on a park bench and showed him the page. Hard money lenders, he explained. 14 to 22% interest, 12 to 24-month terms, and once a payment is missed, California law lets them move to foreclosure in as little as 60 days. They will take the house, Walter. Minutes later, my phone rang. Meridian itself, notifying me as a party of record, because when I'd transferred the house to David, my attorney had insisted on a clause retaining 400 square meters of the underlying land parcel in my own name. A small anchor I'd nearly forgotten. It turned out to be everything. I called my attorney, Thomas Webb, and told him to pull every file, the deed, the retention clause, everything on Meridian. He confirmed what I suspected. I owned the land under the house. David owned only the structure. Meridian's lien covered the structure alone. A lender cannot cleanly foreclose and sell a building sitting on land it doesn't control. My ownership created a title defect that made their whole collateral position weak. That was exactly why they'd called me. I told Thomas I wanted to buy the note myself. Not to punish David, to make sure no stranger held the power to take the house out from under him. Thomas didn't flinch. He drew the papers. Before that closed, Richard Collins showed up at my front door in a charcoal suit, expecting to see Amanda. I stepped into the doorway instead. I reminded him, calmly, precisely, of 2008 and the bond I'd co-signed, of 2017 and the material substitution my engineer had documented in a report I'd kept every year since. His face went the color of old concrete. "That project passed inspection," he said, voice cracking. "It did," I answered. "Inspectors don't always pull cores from freshly poured sections. I do. I keep everything, Richard. It's a habit." I told him to get off my porch. He left rattled, promising this wasn't finished. To Amanda, not to me. That evening, Amanda finally told me everything. 8 months of Richard threatening to release private photographs unless she stayed compliant. Extortion, plain and simple, a felony under California law. I told her that clearly. What he'd built his control on wasn't strength. It was a crime, and crimes have consequences. She broke down, not from despair this time, but relief. The release of a person who has been holding a wall up alone and finally feels another hand under it. David came home to find us both at the table and knew, instantly, that something had shifted. I didn't explain. Not yet. At Thomas's office, I signed the purchase of David's note. $321,000. Nearly everything I had left from selling my company years ago. Thomas asked if I understood what I was taking on. I'd become David's creditor, holding every enforcement right Meridian once had. "I'm not going to enforce it," I told him. "I'm going to make sure no one else can." Then I asked him to help me set up something else, a small foundation, in my father's memory, for working men and women pushed out by age or injury. He said we'd talk. We did. That night at dinner, Amanda finally confronted David outright. How long had he known about Richard's threats? Since April, he admitted. 8 months of silence, protecting a business contract instead of protecting his wife. Amanda's voice shattered completely. "Get away from me!" She went upstairs, and I sat in the next room, absorbing grief for both of them, and a strange, cold sorrow for my own son that I didn't yet know what to do with. The next morning, I set an old brown household ledger on the kitchen table, the one Helen had started decades earlier, logging every bill, every grocery run, every repair. Every entry for the last 3 months was in my handwriting, paid from my own night shift paychecks. Electric bills, water, the porch light bulb Helen had insisted on. Not $1 of David's or Amanda's money. I signed the final page in full. Walter James Hayes. Amanda found it first. She sat with both hands pressed to the pages, sobbing. Not performance, but the raw grief of someone finally seeing the truth of what she'd accused me of. The exact week she'd called me a freeloader. I told David everything that evening. Meridian, the purchase, the new terms, 30-year amortization, interest capped at prime, nothing more, structured so he could actually pay it. "Why would you do that for me?" he asked, undone. "Because the house was built by my hands," I said, "and no stranger was taking it over a debt I could prevent. That's not forgiveness, David. That's just what I am." I gave notice that I'd be leaving at week's end. I served one last shift on Oak Creek Lane beside Mike, patched the final section smooth, and stood looking down the length of a road I'd first poured in 2003 and repaired for 11 months straight. "Built right the first time," Mike said. "Just needed someone to come back and take care of it." On my last morning, David and Amanda were waiting at the table, neither having slept. I told them the house was theirs, the debt would come due on fair terms, and that if David was ever drowning again, he was to call me, not a request. He broke down completely, for the first time without trying to hold it in. Amanda apologized again, stripped of every rehearsed edge. I told her only to take care of herself. That mattered more than she understood. I drove Oak Creek Lane one final time, watched Mike's crew working a section near the far intersection, and merged onto the highway as the city fell away behind me. I thought about what I was leaving, a road that holds, a house that finally belongs to someone, a debt with terms a man can actually pay, and a small foundation carrying my father's kind of name, built to help people who spend their lives doing the work that holds everything else up. I've learned this in 68 years of building things and watching them stand or fall. The most durable structures are never built from pride or fear. They're built from something quieter, honesty, even when no one's watching, even when the people closest to you have stopped believing you're worth watching at all. If someone in your house is drowning, don't wait for them to ask for the rope. Offer it first. It costs far less than the alternative.